And now on Book TV on C-SPAN 2, live from the Brooklyn Book Festival, it's a conversation about race and the 2020 election.
Очень красивый город. 40 лет. Собаки мы собрали. Спасибо.
Сколько вы там жили?
10 лет. В основном в Москве, но тоже в Питере и в Узбекистане.
Okay. Greetings, everyone. My name is Ted Ham. I'm the editor of Frederick Douglass in Brooklyn and a professor of journalism, at St. Joseph's College in Clinton Hill here in Brooklyn. I want to welcome you to the Brooklyn Book Festival panel and assure you that books for sale are available in the courtyard after the panel. The authors will be deeply grateful for your support. And the panelists, our esteemed panel today includes Mr. Matt Taibbi, who's a Rolling Stone columnist, and his latest book is Hate, Inc. The next panelist is Jonathan Metzl. His book is Dying of Whiteness. And he's also a professor of sociology and psychiatry at Vanderbilt University. And Sayu Bhojwani, to my right here, is the founder and president of New American Leaders, an organization that promotes the incoming new immigrants into politics. And her book is People Like Us, the New Wave of Candidates Knocking at Democracy's Door. All right, so I thought we'd start with a moment of silence for Bill de Blasio's presidential campaign. And now continue. So we'll start with Matt. You missed that?
I've been moving.
Okay. Okay, Matt. So
No.
can you tell us what is Hate, Inc.?
So Hate Inc. It started off as a rethink of manufacturing consent. It was a book that I was really influenced by a lot before I joined the journalism business myself, and I thought it would be interesting to go back and look at it, whether the model held up in the internet age, whether anything had changed since 1988 or 89, but it ended up being a lot about how the business of journalism has changed, particularly in the last 30 years, particularly the commercial strategies of our business, a lot of things that I've lived through personally. There are a lot of pressures in the business that are new. We have a very divided landscape now, as opposed to when I was growing up and when my father, who was also a television reporter, came up through the business when there were only a few media companies and all the networks were trying to get the widest possible audience. We now have a completely atomized and fragmented media landscape where the Fox business model, which they pioneered in the 90s, which was let's forget about going for the whole audience, let's pick out a demographic and dominate it by feeding them news stories that they like. That was something that really only they did for a long time, and now I think is kind of common across the board in the media landscape. It's something that you see in CNN and MSNBC and Fox and the Daily Caller, especially on the other side. And what that means for the media business is that we've learned that the easiest way to keep our audiences is to feed people bad news about some other group that they don't like. And of course, Fox has been doing that for a long time on the other side. But this has begun to happen on the sort of blue state media as well. And this is, I think it's accentuated divisions and rancor in our society in a way that's really, really negative. And a lot of reporters I know are kind of quietly disturbed by it because they feel pressure to kind of throw red meat to their audiences. And this has created a disincentive to speak to the whole audience when you do journalism. And I think so that's really what the book is about. It kind of traces the history of the business, why we use the kind of objective, going for the whole audience approach early previous to the 80s, the end of the fairness doctrine, which has incentivized companies to stop doing that. and the commercial pressures that exist now. And that's really what it's about. It's about the segmentation of the media landscape and how do we get out of it, and there aren't any easy answers to that.
And in the book, you make reference to Trump as sort of a product of crossfire.
Yeah, exactly.
Can you explain what you mean?
Well, the crossfire is sort of the template for modern media. I mean, one of the things that happened with there are a bunch of things that happened in the 80s that really radically affected our business. One of them was the development of the 24-hour news landscape, which suddenly put pressure on the news business to create tons and tons and tons of content. Rather than a couple of news broadcasts a day and one newspaper per day, suddenly we had oceans of time to fill. And one of the things that the networks found out was that one of the easiest and cheapest ways to develop content, well, the first thing they found out was that the best kind of story was like a visual breaking news story, like a baby down a well, a submarine that sinks to the bottom of the ocean, something that's dramatic. We have pictures of it. We want to see what's happening every minute. People have to stay tuned in. But that's expensive. You have to send a crew out. You have all these production costs. And the cheaper thing to do is just to put two idiots on screen and have them argue with each other, because it has the appearance of action, but it's a completely phony kind of product. But people get very heavily invested in it. And Crossfire was a very, very successful show that sent trained audiences to consume not only media but politics in a certain way. Like they understood that not only are there really only two ideas in the world, there's left and right, Democrat and Republican, conservative and liberal, but that those two ideas can never come to an accommodation. They never agree about anything. They must always be fighting because the premise of the show doesn't work otherwise. Your rooting interest stops if you turn on Crossfire and they agree about something. The show is a dud. And so sort of through the years, they found that you don't have to just do a panel show. You can do the whole news that way. And that's, I think, where we are now. We really, instead of having news, we have basically whole channels that are one side of the Crossfire argument or the other, and that's what the media is. And I think it's become very destructive.
And what about when the news media agrees but chooses a really dumb storyline, like the one you mentioned about John McCain and the budget, the Pentagon's budget?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No. I mean, I think that so. A classic example here of how news media works. You have the 2018 military budget, which had the largest single-year increase in our history, $82 billion, which is an enormous sum of money. It's about as much as it costs to do a year of the Iraq War. And when the budget finally passed, the lead story on most of the networks wasn't about the massive increase or what that meant or what was in it. There were new forms of nuclear weapons in there. That wasn't in most of the stories. The big story was that everybody led with was that Donald Trump had failed to congratulate John McCain or mention him when he signed the bill because McCain's name was in the bill. And so this was sort of classic outrage media. Both Republicans and Democrats were upset about it. The kind of hashtag resistance crowd was upset about it because John McCain represented the kind of sort of older, respectable kind of politician, and we don't take well to insulting that kind of person. And then, of course, the Republicans were upset about it as well. So it's just an example of how commercialized media works. You just ignore the important story because it's too complicated. It's bipartisan, raising the military budget, and you take the quick hit that gets people upset. And they're going to tune in and they're going to keep reading and watching, and that's why we have lousy media, because we don't have to do the in-depth story. We know we can keep you on watching, doing something dumber.
Okay, so let's change gears a little bit. Jonathan, your book is called Dying of Whiteness, as opposed to The Dying of Whiteness. So can you explain why?
Yeah, sure, gladly. I mean, I can't decide if I'm talking about the downstream implications of what Matt's talking about or the upstream implications. But basically, my book represents about 7 or 8 years of research that I did in the Midwest and the South. And I really look at the rise of politics that claim to make America, and particularly white America, great again. What I found, basically to summarize the main argument, is that the politics that claim to restore working class white America to greatness end up making many people's lives, including working class white lives, harder, sicker, and in many cases quite literally shorter. I went to, the book traverses topics including guns, resistance to the Affordable Care Act, tax cuts that eviscerated roads, bridges, and schools, notably schools. I did interviews in Kansas, in Tennessee, where I currently teach, and in Missouri. And what I found was that on one hand, the politics that those positions represent, on one hand, really represent a return to an ideology that many people increasingly agreed with, this idea of kind of anti-government, anti-immigrant, pro-gun politics. But just from a demographic and kind of statistical level, they ended up being as dangerous to working class white supporters as were asbestos or secondhand smoke or not wearing seatbelts in cars. The data that I shows how much they literally decreased people's lifespans by quite measurable degrees. And it makes sense when you think about it, right? Here are states that, for example, could have adopted Medicaid expansion but decided not to. Here are states that had common sense gun laws, and instead what happened was guns flooded the public sphere. And so what happened, again, as a physician, was that these took a cumulative effect on public health. And I'm writing as both an academic, but also as somebody who grew up in Missouri, and I live in Tennessee now. So this is kind of where I live. And in part, my book was written out of frustration about the politics of what was happening, what was upending what had been traditional senses of collaboration, and instead this idea that basically immigrants and minorities are gaming the system, that people are out to get you. The minute that took hold in politics, it had dramatic negative effects, really for all working class and middle income people, including the people who you would think would be benefiting from those politics.
Mm-hmm. So would you call it, what's the matter with Missouri, Tennessee, and Kansas?
On steroids, yes.
So tell us about Missouri. Tell us about the gun issue in Missouri.
Yeah, it's a perfect example because it's not overtly, obviously, about whiteness per se. I grew up in Kansas City. My parents are upset with me right now because I'm having this panel during the Kansas City Chiefs football game, and the Missouri that I it was delayed. Thank you. I did not pay this man, but the Missouri that I grew up in, there were many different political opinions, and people just largely found a way to get along, and guns is a perfect example of it. In the Kansas City that I grew up in, there were people who were pro-hunting and had grown up with guns in their families, and there were people who had never touched a gun and didn't want to go near one. And there was a system in place that was kind of maybe a little bit uneasy at times, but a kind of equilibrium. If you wanted a gun in a state like Missouri, you could certainly get one. There were plenty of guns, but for example, to carry a gun in public, you had to go to the sheriff's office and be interviewed and get what was called a permit. And it really was a responsibility. Sometimes there were shooting tests you had to take, showing proficiency. And what happens starting around the year 2008 is that there's a dramatic shift in state governance in which politicians come over. This is kind of the rise of the Tea Party and the extreme right. And the NRA starts to become a far more dominant force in state politics. And what they did between 2008 and 2015 was really upended all of the gun laws for the state to the point where you could be 18 years old and walk into Walmart and walk out with an AR-15 and nobody would ask you a question. You could go to a gun show and do that, and nobody would even ask you for any kind of test. And so really part of the story is what happens when that happens in a state, right, in a place like Missouri, where it becomes far easier to get guns. And one of the things I found was that if you just don't think about guns when they're being shot, it changed the way people interacted with each other. White open carry patriots. I went on a march actually as part of the research, walking through African American areas of St. Louis, holding up their AR-15s. African American pastors who I interviewed for the book saying, we're supposed to be like the face of gangbangers and stuff, but we're just afraid of white people right now. And so all these guns changed the ways that people interacted. But there was another story beneath the news story, which was as guns became more and more prevalent in Missouri, there was a dramatic rise in white gun suicide. And so for me, the most painful part of the research for the book was that I sat in on support groups for families who had lost children or spouses or grandparents to gun suicide in the very southern part of Missouri in Cape Girardeau. And no matter what your politics are, it's just, there's nothing like the pain that was in that room. But the interesting thing was people would come to the interviews with me having lost family members to gun suicide, but they would be wearing camouflage and bringing their AR-15s. And they did that to tell me, this terrible thing happened to us, but we just want to tell you it's not the gun's fault. And so we would interrogate, again, I grew up in Missouri. These are people I knew growing up, but I just really interrogated, what does it mean to say it's not the gun's fault? And what do you imagine the gun doing for you? And I think really that became really the most powerful part of all the research I did.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We'll come back to the other two states. Sayu, can you tell us about your analysis of new immigrant candidates and some of the dilemmas they face as on the whole? You're also writing about candidates at all levels of government, right, from city council to state and federal legislatures.
Yeah, so this is a very hopeful book. I just want to start by saying that, particularly.
These are hopeful.
Ironically, I mean, you might think that immigrants who are under attack in all ways and have been facing attacks for several administrations now would be really discouraged by democracy. But I start by saying it's hopeful because I think of immigrants and refugees as being some of the most optimistic of Americans. Like, we truly believe in the possibility of American democracy, and we are doing everything we possibly can now, but have been doing everything we possibly can to build the democracy that we came here believing that we were coming to. And the book that I've written is organized around what I started to see as the systemic obstacles to voices like mine being in politics. And I tell the stories of 11 people who ran and won office in 2016 or before. And the reason that I got this book out last year is because, I wanted to tell these hopeful stories, and I wanted to share that this has been happening prior to the election of Donald Trump, and that even in the year that Donald Trump won in Arizona, for example, two women whose stories I tell in my book won state office, one of whom is formerly undocumented, and one who is half Palestinian and half Latina. Even in the year that Donald Trump won in Georgia, a gay Korean American won state legislative office. And it was important to me to tell these stories, but also to analyze the issues that have existed in our democracy long before the election of Donald Trump, right? That we have a unified enemy, possibly, I think all of us in this room have a unified enemy in Donald Trump and in the current incarnation of the Republican Party. But when this unified enemy goes away, and when we have someone, that is a relatively centrist Republican or a centrist Democrat, for that matter, that many of us who are not experiencing the day-to-day trauma of being working class, of being a person of color, or being an immigrant, go back to business as usual. And I think that, it's so hopeful to see all of you in this room as well on this beautiful Sunday, one of the few that we're probably going to have for the next few months in New York, because I do think that there's a level of energy in our and belief in the importance of us in our democracy. But what I want to encourage folks to do is to think about what's happening at our local and state level, and how the example that you gave of Missouri, right, and what we saw happen with the Tea Party elections in previous midterms, and how we chose to ignore this as some sort of marginal thing that was happening that we in New York didn't have to think about, or that we who had certain access didn't have to think about. So the story is about the issues of public finance. It's the issues of redistricting, and not in the way that we often think about redistricting as gerrymandering, but what does it mean to have, for example, districts like the one we have in New York City, where the council member is elected by a group of constituents in a certain geographic area, which allows for working class people who don't have generational wealth, people who are not as well known, to get elected. I talk about dark money through the story of Jose Moreno, who, again, another formerly undocumented person who won a seat on the Anaheim City Council. he raised about $70,000 for that race, and Disney, through various entities, spent $1 million trying to defeat him and making sure that he wasn't elected. So these are the kinds of examples of how I address kind of systemic issues through the stories of individuals. And I'll just mention, because Ted asked me about Ilhan, I also tell the story of Ilhan Omar in this book. And this...
Can I ask you a specific question about that? Something I didn't know, which is that her district is 63% white. Is that what you say in the book?
But an increasingly diverse district that has a large number of Somali Americans, but also a lot of young people.
Okay.
And I think I say this because, Ilhan, many of us came to know Ilhan when she got elected to Congress, or perhaps many of you got to know Ilhan through a tweet by Donald Trump. But the Ilhan, whose story I tell in this book, was elected to the Minnesota State Legislature in 2016. And she defeated a 44-year incumbent, a person who was elected to office before she was born. And what that means is that there's the power of incumbency that had transcended the changes in that district, that had frankly transcended this particular legislator's ability to serve the district, right? It's not so much that she had been in office for so long, but that she had lost touch with the reason she got elected in the first place was to be accountable to her constituents. And I think that having someone like Ilhan in that position, she basically built a campaign infrastructure that when Keith Ellison, whose seat she now occupies, when Keith Ellison decided not to run for Congress in order to run for a statewide seat in Minnesota, she had a campaign infrastructure to rely on. And so I kind of am a missionary for state and local elections as well, because they help people build the chops that they need to run for Congress or statewide elections.
Sure. Okay. We'll come back to some of the other examples you mentioned. Matt, you have a chapter on Trump and as the WWE candidate, but you go further into depth with that analysis than most people. Everyone has seen the footage of him with Vince McMahon and so on. But
so that was during the 2015-2016 campaign when I was following Trump around. All of the other reporters were picking up books about Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, like books about nationalism, authoritarianism, and I very quickly decided that the thing to do was to start reading books about wrestling, because that would explain Trump's candidacy much better. So I read a book called Controversy Creates Cash by Steve Bischoff, who's a wrestler. Trump was, and people who are in the business will tell you this. I talked to some wrestlers about this. He's a classic heel act, and the problem that I'm talking about in the book is that the WWE and pro wrestling is a brilliant, very profitable media formula that works on a very simple theatrical device. It pits a good guy who's always who's the baby face versus the bad guy who's called the heel. And they play up the confrontation. The heel's job is to walk into the arena and taunt everybody and say all kinds of outrageous things and get the crowd upset. And the whole idea is to divide the crowd into two groups, one who's sort of rooting for the good guy to win and one who's sort of secretly rooting for the bad guy to hit the good guy in the face with a chair. And Trump, the brilliance of this, and people who follow wrestling will tell you that this formula doesn't work unless you have a good heel. Like the more evil and more provocative the heel is, the more money everybody makes. And that's what happened with the news media in 2015 and 2016, and has continued. Cable profits have gone up 37% since Trump announced his run for the presidency, because he's the perfect heel. He makes everybody money on both sides of the aisle, and the cycle is always the same. He's in every confrontation with anybody, whether it's within the Republican Party or with Hillary Clinton, he does the heel act. He taunts the opponent. He says outrageous things. And he eventually goads the audience into taking sides. And his whole strategy is to sort of eventually turn headlines in his favor. And he'll do this by manipulating the news media into building up the conflict, because they have a natural desire to sort of play up the equilibrium between the combatants, because that will make the fight more equal, and it will attract more and more viewers. And this is what Trump did throughout 2015, 2016. He always ends up making the opponent seem like a pompous, self-righteous good guy. Like Jeb Bush was the classic example. Like he taunts Bush's wife. Says Bush is soft on immigrants because his wife is Mexican. Bush acts outraged. He in public he shows outraged dignity. And Trump insults his mother, and he says, "My mother's the strongest person I've ever met." Trump says she should be running, and this turns into a win for Trump on the media front. And I think what I'm trying to get to is that it works as entertainment. It's perfect entertainment, which is why news companies are making a ton of money right now. They know that this is a formula that will draw people in, and they're using a very manipulative formula, especially with audiences who hate Trump. They're showing you images of things they know are upsetting, that will scare you, and then they offer you micro doses of sort of relief and solidarity by sort of offering you solutions. They'll show you a picture of an opposition politician who'll promise to fight against him, and the newsreader will sort of show some solidarity with that politician, and you feel like you're doing something by watching the show. You're not. You're watching a show, and that's the secret to the ratings. That's why the ratings have gone up, and Trump has manipulated this brilliantly, and he's doing it again, and he's likely to do it again, especially if he goes against somebody who doesn't know how to play this game, next year. So that's what that was about.
Okay, so you're describing it as sort of addictive infotainment, right?
Absolutely.
But, and you say it's like smoking or like tobacco.
It's like smoking, and it's and people will tell you. I talk to people who are internet analysts, and they'll tell you this is absolutely a new form of addiction that's very nearly as toxic as smoking or drinking. People become very, very addicted to the dopamine rushes they get when they click onto media, and they get rushes of anger that are followed by rushes of relief and solidarity they get by watching friendly faces on television. And that's why people spend all day long clicking, because it's an addiction. It's like smoking. Even the feel of your phone is part of the addiction, the same way that the feel of a cigarette or the lighting of the lighter is part of the smoking addiction. So that's part of what I'm talking about.
Well, that's a good segue into Jonathan's discussion of healthcare in Tennessee, particularly during the period in which there was a rollback, a period of Obamacare and Medicaid expansion, that the governor of Tennessee was trying to put forth an alternative plan and to undercut Obamacare and rejecting Medicaid. So tell us about what you found.
Right. No, I was going to make a joke that people are at home addicted to C-SPAN book TV. But anyway, I think it's actually a perfect example, because people aren't just divided randomly. They're divided, at least in this stuff that I do, based on existing fault lines that maybe have been improved over time or things like that. But really what I'm looking at are the historical fault lines around race, particularly in the South and the Midwest, and how easy it is sometimes to manipulate people once you tap into historical anxieties about this. And health insurance is a perfect example. The research that I did in Tennessee was done in a state where there's a long history of who has the right to have health insurance, what kind of bodies are insurable. And so even though the Affordable Care Act, which is what I was studying in Tennessee in 2012 through 2015, made a ton of sense for the state, there was this historical fault line, which was that Tennessee and other southern states, really historically, there was a history of white people got health insurance and black people were property, and there was a specific kind of slave insurance. And so just the idea of whose body is worth insuring and whose body can be insured is something that had played out in the history of the South, at least. Every time there had been some kind of attempt to nationalize the healthcare system from, Truman and, on down. And every time there was this kind of sense of what's going to happen when you desegregate the hospital wards or something like that, something that tapped into race. And I just kind of watched this happen with the Affordable Care Act story. Now, the interesting thing about the Affordable Care Act in Tennessee is that in many ways, it was manna from heaven for the state. Tennessee is a state that has very poor health outcomes, very poor community health. About 70% of the population has some form of obesity or chronic illness. Tennessee is also a state that tried to insure all of its people because many health insurance companies are in Tennessee. And so there was a program called TennCare where they tried to give everybody insurance in the state in the 1990s, but they went bankrupt because people were so sick that they couldn't do it. And so in the middle of all this stuff, a state with poor health outcomes that had tried to insure its people, comes the Affordable Care Act, a program who, at least in name, in 2010, when it started to roll out, was going to create a safety net of health insurance for people. It was going to provide funds for community health. It was exactly the problem that Tennessee faced. And the research that I do in the book shows how initially there was support for this, right? There were a lot of sick people who were down with what was happening. And my colleagues and I basically did focus groups. We did about 30 or 40 focus groups across the state, interviewing Black and white men. Along the way, starting in 2008, 2010, 2012, 2013. And what we saw was that these messages that basically immigrants and minorities are going to game the system became increasingly powerful messages. People remember there were these posters of Obama as an African witch doctor and things like that. And so the minute the debate became racialized, it tapped into these historical tensions. And again, I just tell one research story that was really profoundly powerful. We did a focus group in rural Tennessee with white men who were chronically ill, who were literally dying, came to the focus groups with oxygen masks. One guy had a walker. He was 35 because he was having liver failure, and it was too painful to walk. And we would ask these guys, hey, look, here's the Affordable Care Act as a possibility of helping you. And they said, well, we know it might help us. And this is a quote from one of my research subjects. He said, but there's no way I'm signing up for a program that will help Mexicans and welfare queens. And so this idea that somebody else is going to game the system was such a powerful, divisive tool that within 5 years of marketing or politics or things like that, people were actually literally willing to give up their own health care. And for me in the book, it became a lesson for things like the messages like Medicare for All, for example, that there are these pre-existing tensions. And the minute they become racialized or tap into these racial fault lines, it's really the idea. I'm not going to say it's illogical. It's just a different kind of logic. If your logic is that there's a hierarchy and you don't want to ruin that hierarchy, when it taps into that, it's not like everybody's just going to say, "Oh gosh, healthcare, that's great for me." So it really was the part about Tennessee really was a story about the depths to which people felt that they identified with this hierarchy to the point where they were literally willing to give up their own health care.
Mm-hmm. And can you just briefly describe the Kansas issue of austerity and education?
Yeah, so Kansas was another story. And by the way, I will say that I do have a lot of hopeful stories in my book also. I know I'm Debbie Downer right now. But, I also, I'm a child of an immigrant, and I myself was born not in this country, and I do end the book by saying that there are systems of equality that have been in place actually in places like the South. So it's not like this has always been that way. So I hopefully we'll have some time for a kumbaya moment for me in the end. But I will say that Kansas was the last part of the story, which was a story about really what happened. Kansas had the 5th or 6th ranked public school system in the United States. After Brown versus Board of Education, Kansas actually very seriously invested in its public education, and it had tremendous results. The 4th and 8th grade reading exams, for example, for students across the state, it showed dramatic improvement, and that was true for white kids, but also for Latino kids, African American kids. Kansas really was a top 10 public school system across the board. Great high school dropout rates, very positive rates of going on to at the job market. So there was a source of pride in the education system. And then this guy named Sam Brownback comes down the pike, and he basically says, the government is jobbing you, cut away all these kind of things. And there were massive, massive tax cuts. And really between, starting 2008, 2010, 2012, Kansas cut its public school system more than any state in the country, pretty much. And there's a hopefully reader-friendly kind of data in my book. But if you would just want to see the remarkable effects of what happens when you cut a school system, look at what happened to Kansas, which is that within 2 years of these cuts, it fell totally off the cliff. All these things that were markers of success. So Kansas fell to 42nd, 43rd in the country in terms of these national exams. Dropout rates skyrocketed. And part of the, I guess, ironic twist is that when I interviewed people in Kansas and I'd say, how could you support this to your own schools? And I got a fair amount of the same kind of answers that I'd gotten in other states. People told me, well, minorities are gaming the system and they shouldn't be taking our tax dollars. One person told me, I hear that the black school districts are taking all the tax money and buying party buses for football games. I called the minority district and I'm like, do you guys have any party buses? And they were like, dude, we don't even have textbooks. Like, what are you talking about? So there were all these urban myths about what was happening but it turned out the people who suffered the greatest from these budget cuts, as in all the other chapters I look at, were white Kansans, because Kansas is about an 85% white state. And so far and away, the people who suffered from these politics the worst in terms of high school dropout rates. Actually, I show in the book, high school dropout correlates with about a 5 to 7 year shorter lifespan. So I just added up how many life years was this costing white Kansans. And it turned out that these politics that were supposed to be penalizing minorities ended up penalizing white Americans, white Kansans, far more than anybody else.
Wow. Okay, so you mentioned Moreno in, what's his name, Joe Moreno?
Yes.
Yeah, in Anaheim, and Disney spending $1 million to defeat him, but he only had raised $70,000.
Yeah, I mean,
how did he do it?
That's a story of organizing, right?
Yeah.
And the value of having a candidate who was connected to the community and used organizing and people power as a way to win. But it's also a story of the way that dark money, particularly after the passage of Citizens United, has affected races at the very local level, right? That there is an ability to hide the way that money gets to a candidate that didn't used to exist before. But that so there's several sections in the book, and one section is generally around the role of money in politics. And Jose's chapter is about dark money, and then I mentioned Isela as well. And Isela and Athena, who use the clean election system in Arizona, there's a whole range of public financing systems. The one we have in New York is matching dollars, right? So I, as a candidate, even without a lot of money, can go to people and raise money and then get now it's an 8-to-1 match in New York City. And there's work being done to get that matching funding program happening at the state level, because imagine what Albany could look like if it wasn't. So there's a couple of things in Albany. One is that up until this year, I think it was, that people were getting paid $78,000 a year for what was ostensibly a part-time job, right? Which in New York, I mean, $78,000 is not so bad, but they've now addressed it so that there's going to be raises for the next 3 years. So it means that someone who is working class, has student loans, doesn't have generational wealth, could, with the combination of the public financing system and a salary that is a legitimate full-time livable wage, can actually run for office and then serve. But when you look at states like Arizona and Colorado and Florida and Georgia, where the legislature was really set up. I mean, we've been talking about these various systems, and people often say that the system is broken, but I always say that the system is working exactly like it's supposed to, right? The system was set up by our founding fathers, who were wealthy white landowning males, to work for wealthy white landowning males. And so when you look at who's in Congress, when you look at who's in the state legislature, in this moment, it is working just the way it was supposed to work for the types of people it was supposed to work for. If you live in Arizona and you make $24,000 a year as a state legislator, sure, it's a part-time job and you're only supposed to be in the legislature between January and March or April when the budget passes. What kind of job? I mean, how many of us have the kind of jobs that we can just go to the state legislature for 4 months out of the year? And then if you don't have another job, then you can't make a wage. And so you have this, and all around the country, we have mostly older people, mostly either older because they're retired or older because they're wealthy, or younger folks who are wealthy and can afford it or have a partner. And so the reason this is even more than the cost of campaigns, what we are paying our representatives to do the work that we want them to do is a particular passion point for me, because I don't think we're going to change the kind of policies that are being made at the state and local level if we don't have the types of people who are, Ayanna Pressley says it's the people closest to the pain that can help shape the policy, right? And if people are not experiencing the pain of having their kids in public schools, of not being able to access health care, of feeling unsafe when their family members go to school or go to work, then it's really hard for them to account for that. And I think it all starts with the lack of acknowledgement that the types of people who should be making policy are regular people. And that's not at all coincidental. As you all know, the founding fathers really wanted citizen legislatures. And then this last point I'm going to make, there's on Friday, Politico did published a list of, I think it's 100 or 99 ways to improve our political system. And I argue for full-time state legislatures, because I think that if you're not getting people who can afford to be in office, we're not going to get the kind of policy we want. And someone argues for paying Congress members less, because some people believe that $175,000 is too much money to be paying Congress members. But what I can tell you quite emphatically is that if we reduce that wage, then you're not going to get the people that we're seeing now coming into office who have very realistic concerns about about making a living wage. And so this connection between politics and economics, between our democracy and the democratic inequality and structural inequality we're seeing in our economy and democracy are very, very tied.
Okay, but can you go back to Moreno and say,
yes, sure.
Tell us what was Disney worried about with somebody?
Disney was worried about, they basically run the city of Anaheim, right? Or at least attempt to. And so they were concerned about Jose coming in and fighting for concessions for low-wage workers, for arguing against some economic development and building that would affect the local communities and push people out for the sake of economies, for Disney's expansion.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I mean, that was the particular concern that they had.
Sure. So that plays out here as well. Mm-hmm. We were talking about Sunset Park before we started here. We can save that for another conversation. But okay, so let's do one more round and talking about the 2020 election, how things are shaping up. Matt, you've actually written favorably about Elizabeth Warren in the past, haven't seen some comments of yours. Yep. And can you talk about her work in the bailout? That's when she first sort of became prominent, right?
Yeah, I mean, Elizabeth Warren, I think, I was actually one of the first people to suggest Elizabeth Warren's candidacy for the presidency a long time ago. Although I have more concerns now that I've seen her on the campaign trail. But Elizabeth Warren, I think, really stood out in the period between 2008 and maybe 2012, because she was one of the only members of Congress who was really literate about the modern financial products. And I think one of the things that was exposed after 2008 is that whole ranges of financial products that had been figured heavily in the crash, particularly derivatives, credit default swaps, collateralized debt obligations, things like that. There were I would say 90% of the members didn't even know what those were. I remember particularly during the Dodd-Frank Reform Act negotiations, they had a terrible problem trying to find somebody to write the portion of the bill that involved clearing of derivatives, because there was not a single member who had somebody on staff who was familiar with the issue. So they were essentially calling up professors and asking them to volunteer to help put this legislation together. So this was something that Elizabeth Warren at least understood. For instance, how subprime mortgages worked, how they were, turned into securities, securitized, pooled, all those things, and so that was impressive. I think she was impressive when she led the questioning against, for instance, the CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase, Jamie Dimon. She really understood those issues. For instance, the London Whale episode, she understood exactly what happened there. She understood why it was irresponsible and unacceptable for the company not to be aware of an overnight $6 billion loss, for instance, and what kind of a problem that represented for a federal government that was bailing these companies out. So, yeah, I think that was something that really spoke tremendously in her favor, and that's probably one of the reasons why she has a good reputation, especially with American liberals. Yeah.
But do you think that translates into a winning ticket?
I mean, my concern about Elizabeth Warren, and I like her personally, is just that it comes from covering campaigns in the past. One of the contributing factors to the rise of Donald Trump was this widespread growing suspicion and mistrust of institutions and experts. And you see this all across the country. Most Americans, most voters don't have exposure to billionaires. They don't meet the people who actually run Fortune 500 companies, but they do have a lot of interaction with corporate middle management, with people who are, lawyers, educators, people who work in universities, and there's a tremendous amount of tension between, the sort of middle intelligentsia in this country and the sort of working class voters, and especially in red states. And what I worry about with Elizabeth Warren is her argument is predicated on the kind of the same argument that a lot of Democrats have made in, over the course of the last 20, 30 years. We've had a lot of sort of super smart, detail-oriented politicians like Al Gore, John Kerry, Mike Dukakis in the past. Hillary Clinton, absolutely. And I would say Hillary and Warren don't have a ton in common, but this is an area where they definitely do. And this whole, I have a plan for that, we're gonna fix it, we're gonna be good government on steroids, that whole thing. I'm not sure how much traction that's gonna have going forward, and that's one of the reasons why. I mean, it's gotten better now, but if you looked at the polls, the head-to-head polls with Warren, as opposed to say Biden or Sanders or any of those other candidates versus Trump, she lagged a little bit behind. I think that explains it. That and the fact that she was kind of a Fox News focus for a while for other reasons.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And Jonathan, what extent do you think Medicare for All and other policy issues like that can try to help overcome some of the entrenched racial hostilities that you found?
Well, I think really that it's kind of joining both of these other tensions, right? Which is I think that it'll be important and interesting to see how that plays out. But I also think that there are caveats that I try to highlight in my work, right? Because on one hand, who doesn't want health care, right? If you're sick, you want to be able to go to the doctor. You other things that were huge in the South that the Affordable Care Act helped with. It wasn't just health insurance. It was being able to afford medications. Medical bankruptcies in states like Kentucky that did the Medicaid expansion actually had far fewer medical bankruptcies. So many different factors in states like Kentucky, which is the one state in the South that actually adopted the Affordable Care Act, got better. And people saw, I do a lot of Kentucky versus Tennessee comparisons in my work. And people in Kentucky started going to the doctor for a routine visit. They were less sick when they went to the doctor. They didn't avoid medical treatment because of cost. All these things. So people in Kentucky, their life got better. And 3 or 4 years into the Kentucky experiment, what happened is there was another governor who came down the pike, and he basically said, minorities and immigrants are gaming the system. Let's do anti-government, all this kind of stuff. And people voted out their literally their own health care in a way. And so part of what I'm trying
That doesn't sound very hopeful.
well, I guess my point is that there's a caveat to Medicare for All, which is that there are these tensions and how you address those tensions. But I think the times where I am given pause is when I talk to progressive audiences and there's this assumption, well, the minute people get on this health plan, they're going to see how beneficial healthcare is for them. And I don't know the answer to this, but I guess the question I have is how much do you take history into account, right? Because you're just stepping into a 200-year argument right here. And so if people were going to get down the minute they got healthcare, they would have been happy with the Affordable Care Act for all, and things like that. And so I think that there are some caveats here, and how to address that I think is going to be very important.
Okay. And Sayu, what's your prognosis in terms of the slate of candidates that you foresee?
Well, I'll just say, I'm not going to offer a prognosis of an individual, but what I will say is that campaigns are won in the field, right? They're not won in rooms like this. They're not won by polls, for sure. And one of the concerns that I have is the ongoing conversation about this kind of Trump-Obama swing voter, the white working class, and to the expense of, look, there are 2.2 million people who became citizens since 2016. There are 8 states in which the margin of victory could be closed just by relying on those newly naturalized citizens. 8 states that Trump won. No one is having those conversations. The work that gets done in those communities is primarily by under-resourced nonprofits, right? So I think that the candidate who can win the election is the candidate who's going to use the old math, for sure, because I do not think that we should be ignoring any constituent group. But I think someone who can mobilize this group of voters who feels marginalized for economic and other reasons, but can also mobilize voters who are largely ignored, is potentially the candidate who can win this race, because it is going to be won in the field. I mean, it's not going to just be won on TV. I mean, how many of us are going to watch those debates, et cetera, right?
But there are going to be a lot of candidates at the local level and state level.
Yeah. So 2 things I will say about that. One is that I do think that there is some work being done local and state candidates. At the end of the day, it's not the presidential candidate that's going to knock on the door, right? So if we can get local and state voices, trusted messengers to be bringing out those communities, I think that's really important. And then the last thing I will say about this is that immigration as an issue and as a divisive issue is going to play out, in the next election cycle and for several afterwards. And so I think it's all on us to really be able to bring complexity to that conversation. Most of us know that people love immigrants as individuals. They just don't like immigration as an issue. And so to the extent that you're in your dining rooms and your workplaces, you can be having conversations about what the actual message is and what the reality is. It's really important.
Okay, I think we're out of time here, but I just want to point out that no one mentioned the kid from Brooklyn, Bernard Sanders. So I just did.
I mentioned him.
You did. Oh, sorry. I wanted to mention him again. Anyway, a round of applause, and books will be available outside.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah, it's like a negative message. We need a positive message.
Did you get to ask your question?